Welcome to the Surviving to Thriving podcast that helps women leaders in nonprofits get out of survival mode and thrive in both leadership and life. I'm your host, leadership development coach Kathy Archer, and I help women leaders enjoy impactful leadership. I woke up one morning and I hop into the shower, and in my head is this thought: just get me through this meeting. Just get me through this meeting, God. Please just get me through this meeting. And that same thought kept going through my head as I got through breakfast and got the kids out the door and drove to work and get to the office, and I'm preparing for the meeting, and I'm just like, God, please just get me through this meeting. Please just get me through this meeting. And I left the office and I headed over to the other site that we were having the meeting, and it was with the contractor, and it was some stuff had gone down and it wasn't good, and they were questioning, and I had to defend, and I had to, keep it all together. And I made it through that meeting, but it was not fun. It was not easy, but I made it. And the next day I'm in the shower again, and I'm like, oh God, please just let me get through this day. Please just let me get through this day. And I get through breakfast, I get the kids out the door, head to the office, and the whole time it's, God, please just get me through this day. And I've got back-to-back meetings all day. I've got a phone call, and I've got a meeting with one of my staff, and then I have to go to an interagency meeting, and then I've got a conference call later in the afternoon. And then before the end of the day, somebody else is coming to talk to me about one of the new programs that we're doing. And I just had all of this stuff. Plus I had this whole to-do list that I had to get through. And I'm like, just get me through this day. And I did. At the end of the day, I was exhausted. I get home and I'm like, oh my God, I made it. And a few days later, I'm packing my suitcase. And I had to head off to the city, and I had a bunch of meetings. And there was some stuff going on, and I'm like, oh my God, just get me through this next few days. Please just get me through this next few days. I had to, get on the plane. I had to make sure that all the kids' stuff was ready before I left. I had to make sure my husband knew what to do. I had to coordinate stuff that was happening at school. I had to make sure that I had cover off at the office. And I'm like, just get me through the next few days. And you know exactly what happened. I made it through the next few days. But here's the thing. When I realized, get me through this meeting, get me through this day, get me through this next project, get me through this next really busy time, that was a constant mantra in my head. Just get me through. I was stuck in survival mode. And my guess is that you've been there as well. Survival mode is where we're just hanging on. And the truth is, there will always be times. When we're just sort of, I guess, in the middle of COVID, I don't even know if we're at the beginning, middle, or end of COVID anymore. But anyhow, when COVID hit, we were in survival mode. Nobody knew what to expect. We just had to get through the next day, figured this day out, and then we'll get to the next day. That's normal for certain periods of time. Survival mode becomes a problem when we live there rather than visit there. Let's face it, we're always faced with, annual budget cycles, or it's time to renew contracts, or we need to get this big fundraiser in place, or somebody's changed what's happening with the expectations, and so we have to go to a whole bunch of meetings around contracts, or we are going through accreditation. There's always those busy times, and that's the job of a leader. You've probably noticed already that if you've been listening to all these podcast episodes, that it's called the Surviving to Thriving podcast. And at the end of each episode, I often will say, do whatever it is that I've just talked to you about, and that's going to move you from surviving to thriving in both leadership and life. There's a continuum from survival mode to thriving in your leadership and your life. And at any given point in time, you are somewhere along that continuum. Some days you're in survival mode, some days you're thriving. But I want to talk about each of those sort of ends of the spectrum and then the middle point. Today you're going to have a guide sheet, which is a little example of the surviving to thriving continuum, and you can assess where you're at on it. I think many of us sit or live in survival mode, and we think that we're there briefly, but we end up hanging out there for a long, long time, and that's not okay. Let's start with survival mode. And again, many of you know exactly what this is all about. Survival mode is characterized by fear. You're always afraid of dropping the ball or falling apart, that whole composure piece that we've talked about, losing it, like, and freaking out on somebody. You feel like you're just barely hanging on. You're trying to stay alive. It feels like every day's a battle. You just have to suffer through it. When you're in survival mode, you don't have a lot of energy. You're sort of hanging on the edge of empty gas tank all the time. You'll often notice that you're pretty negative. Maybe you're even have gotten to the point where you're just apathetic. You just don't give a damn anymore. And what I also noticed when I was in survival mode, and for many of the women that I work with who are in survival mode, you tend to feel pretty isolated and alone. Doesn't feel like anybody cares about you, doesn't feel like anybody's on your side, doesn't feel like anybody's got your back. In fact, often it feels like people are out to get you. If you're in survival mode, and my guess is it's impacting your team, because that's typically what it does, you're probably in a place where you and your team are constantly putting out fires. There's a lot of crisis management that goes on. You're sort of just sustaining day by day. You can't sort of foresee any future. Often this is what happens when we're in toxic work environments, but you kind of feel like you can't do anything. You've got no control over the world around you. You're afraid somebody's going to figure out one day that you aren't capable, that you don't know what you're doing. And your body lives in sort of that stress crisis mode. And that's physically taxing on your body. You are drained, you're exhausted, you're overwhelmed, overworked, overburdened. Like you just pooped out. You just got nothing left in you. I've often heard women say, I am so done. And, at the end of the day, what happens? We veg out in front of the TV, scroll through our phones, have another glass of wine because there's nothing left. And our bodies never get the opportunity to renew and recharge. We're emotionally, physically, spiritually, mentally drained. The thing is, sometimes we will be there. It's not a point of being in survival mode some days. It's a point of living in survival mode that becomes the problem. Because when you're there, you get to the point where you're not able to be aligned with your values, ethics, morals. You're not able to stay focused on what's important to you. And honestly, it really can hurt you, your character, how people see you. So let's take a moment to look at the opposite end of the spectrum. So if you're not in survival mode, you're probably thriving. And when you're thriving, you're energetic and you're passionate and you've got that enthusiasm that oozes out of you. Think back to when you first started that, new job and you were excited to be in it. You were growing and developing and learning and loving it. Even though it was challenging, you were being stretched probably, but not to the point of snapping. You might, have been really flourishing. Like I say, you had the opportunity to learn new things, take some training. Maybe you were starting a new project, or I remember when I started a new contract and I was really heavily involved in a lot of the training, and it was exciting me to learn it was around fetal alcohol syndrome, and I was learning sort of the brain and how the brain worked, and that was fascinating. And I was connecting with people who I love to sort of learn that. So I was connecting people who were eager to teach that and to start new programs. And so I really felt like I was engaged. I felt like I was supported. I felt like I was connected. I felt like I belonged to this larger community. Like I say, we were across the province at that point in time. We were all working together on this new project, and it really felt like we were making a difference. It felt like we were doing meaningful work. It felt like that work was aligned with my values, my ethics, my morals. I really felt I was being connected, congruent. I was able to affect change in the world. I was able to use a lot of my strengths. And so when I was there, I really felt like I was thriving. My team was thriving. And together, like I say, we were really making a difference. So one end of the spectrum is that survival mode, and then the other is this thriving. And the truth is, we're probably rarely hanging out all the time at one end or the other. We're probably somewhere in between. And again, when you think of the surviving to thriving continuum, some days you are at one end and some days the other. Maybe in the morning you're at one end and at the end of the day you're at the other. What's important to note is where you sort of consistently hang out, which end of it is what you're kind of looking at. And many of us hang out somewhere in the middle. In the middle, I call this sort of the coping mode or the tolerating mode. It's where you're sometimes just barely getting by, but you're not quite to that place of survival mode. Or maybe you're doing pretty good, but you're not to that place of really thriving and completely engaged. Some days are good, some days are okay, some not so great days. But often when we're in the middle, I find that we're tolerating or we're settling for things. We're putting up with stuff or, it's just the way it is. Some of this kind of stuff is never going to change, we'll say. This is the sector. This is what it's like. We put up with a lot of things or settle or tolerate a lot of things. The other thing about the middle place is we're often waiting for things to change, but never really believing they will. And this is kind of that victim mentality again, like, I can't change it. This is what the sector's like. It'll always be crisis driven. Will always be lack of funding. There will always be short staff. I mean, what do you expect? And so again, you're kind of hanging out in the middle, often between sort of surviving and tolerating. And it's that place where, again, you can sort of stay there, which is fine. But what we really find for some people is that rather than that being a place where you come to sometimes, it tends to be a place where you hang out all the time. There's no sort of big challenge or pull for you. There's no big drive to get you up and excited to go to work in the morning. It's like, yep, another day at the office, kind of back to the grind, round and around the hamster wheel we go. When I was there, some days I just sort of felt emotionally flatlined. It was like, yep, another day. And I wasn't excited and I wasn't engaged, but I also wasn't like ticked off and hated the world. It wasn't one of those. It was just kind of there. When you kind of hang out there, you're like, well, it could be worse, right? Often people probably should have changed jobs years ago, but they haven't. They're still there. They're still hanging out in the middle. And again, they're like, I got a good paycheck, get some decent benefits. The work's okay. The work environment's not bad. I'm good. Really? Are you good or are you settling? And so that's what I want you to think about. And again, there's a guide sheet that goes with this. If you go to the notes at the bottom of if you're listening on your app, you can go to the notes on the bottom of the section here and find the link to the guide sheet. Or if you head on over to kathyarcher.com, podcast 17, you'll find it there as well. And it's the continuum. And what I've got is some check mark boxes for you to go through each of the 3 stages for you to kind of get a sense of where you're at. And here's what's important. Again, I think lots of times we hang out sort of in the bottom edge of that tolerating, settling place or in survival mode. And we're really not aware of it. We think, like I say, when I was getting up in the morning and saying, just get me through this day, just get me through this day, I would have said I was in survival mode sometimes. But when I step back and kind of assess where I was at, it was a repetitive day after day after day. I was always just praying to get through whatever it was, the meeting, the day, the trip, the stressful period. I was just praying to get through. And when I could stop and look at that and go, oh my God, I'm hanging out in survival mode 99% of the time, that's not good. And that's why it's important to measure that. What gets measured gets improved. If you're not weighing yourself or trying on your tight jeans once in a while or checking to see how much money you have saved for retirement, you're not going to change what's going on in your life. You need to measure it. So head on over and grab that guide because it's really important for you to look at where you're at so you can start changing it. In next week's podcast, I'm going to talk about how you move from that survival mode to thriving. We're going to talk about 3 steps to get you through the continuum. So make sure you come back then, next week's episode, because you're going to hear that. The other thing is, part of why I wanted to do this podcast today was so that you understood the title of the podcast, but B, I'm working on a course for the training library around wellness at work. Not wellness after work, but wellness at work. And if you look at being stuck in survival mode all of the time, your body is constantly being drained all day. There's, meetings and conversations and reports that you have to do and decisions you have to make and stress that builds and builds and builds. And it's sucking out your physical energy, your emotional energy, your mental, your spiritual energy all day. And most of you didn't, but if you started your day with a full battery, by the end of the day, your battery's drained. And it's drained so much that you do not have enough time at the end of the day to recharge that battery back up to full. So you come home and you are, again, faced with all of the responsibilities in your personal life, and your battery continues to be depleted. And so you cannot wait till the end of your day and hope that, a bubble bath or just zoning out on Netflix is going to recharge that battery back to full. You must put micro moments of self-care into your day of wellness. You need to learn how to recharge throughout your day if you're going to have a full battery to be the best leader you can be. And if you're going to get out of survival mode and move to thriving, you're going to have to figure out how to add wellness moments throughout your day. So that's the current course I'm building. It's not yet into the training library, but it's coming in a few weeks. Inside of the training library, you're going to find that course. So I wanted to come back and do this episode today to get you thinking about where you are on the continuum. Again, next week, we're going to talk about how to move along the continuum. So make sure you come back for that. But for today, head on over, grab your guide sheet, and get a little bit of an assessment of where you're at on the surviving to thriving continuum, because that's going to be the starting point for you to move along the continuum. Remember, when you figure out where you're at, and then we figure out where you want to go, that's how you're going to move from surviving to thriving in both your leadership and life. Go make the rest of your day awesome, my dear. If you found today's episode helpful, then you are going to love the training library. Many women leaders in nonprofits wish that they had a coach or a mentor to help them, but they don't believe that they or their organization can afford it. Oh, but you can. Inside of the training library membership site, you will not only get access to affordable and easily accessible ongoing personal and professional development training, you will also have access to a leadership coach at your fingertips. That way, when you hit those inevitable challenges that leadership will bring your way, you'll have both the resources and the support to navigate your way through them with confidence, composure, and while keeping your integrity intact. To find out more, head to kathyarcher.com/library. If you are enjoying the show, I'd love it if you could leave me a comment or a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks for listening. Go make the rest of your day awesome.